Oh, hello, Wes.
Yep, that's Disneyland for sure.
All right. And with that, we're live on YouTube. All right, welcome everyone. Hey, Wes, I took the liberty of muting you just for the sake of continuation of the call. So yes, welcome everyone. This is the first deep dive call of the Open RFC. So this one we're going to be discussing workspaces. So yeah, the idea here is to deep dive everything about workspaces and come to an agreement so that we can ratify the RFC and move on with implementing the actual workspace feature. So to start maybe with the agenda here, maybe we should do a little round of introduction. I can start. My name is Rui Adorno. I work in the open source team with Darcy and Isaac at NPM. And maybe Darcy, you want to go next?
Sure. My name is Darcy Clark. I work at NPM with Roy, Claudia, Isaac. I'm the engineering manager for open source and community.
I can go. My name is Claudia, and I also work on the open source team at NPM.
I'm Isaac, work on the open source team at NPM, and I've been for a very long time.
Yeah, maybe Daniel?
Okay, I'm Daniel. I work at Zillow, ostensibly, and I am the maintainer of Lerna, which is a popular monorepo framework tool thing.
Awesome, Jordan.
Hi, I'm Jordan, and I use Lerna and a few other places where a Workspaces tool would be helpful.
And Wes, it's fine if you're busy now. Maybe you can talk next.
Wes works at Netflix on build tooling, as far as I remember. And he gives thumbs up.
Yeah, awesome. All right, so yes. Hello. Very busy right now. So yeah, so we should probably, well, I don't think announcements is an item that will go into the deep dive call, although it's in here in the agenda. You can get rid of it. And yes, let's start talking about workspaces. So basically, yeah, NPM wants to introduce support for installing workspaces. One of the things we did for the RFC, we tried to source feedback from the community and get like an ideal RFC. And right now we're going through the process of like thinking about implementation and trying to come up with an actual initial implementation that would make sense from the technical point of view. But also getting a lot of these ideas that we source from the community, things that people want to see in the initial support. So yeah, that's what we want to ratify today, right? So yeah, maybe we should probably start defining the initial scope, what the NPM CLI needs to do, right, in order to support the workspaces. And basically, like the RFC identified three main things. The ability of reading the configuration for workspaces, in which we're basically following the lead for the existing support. There is for like yarn workspaces. So basically you define a workspaces key in your package JSON. You define a list of places using globs, and CLI can parse that and figure out which ones are workspaces within your top level workspace setup. After that is the ability of the CLI to install the things at the proper place, right? So that you can actually use all the packages that live within this workspace setup. And third step is actually being able to use maybe a what we define as a subset of the CLI subcommands that you can actually use in the context of like all the workspaces. So yes, maybe we should probably start with the second thing I mentioned, installing of the workspaces, because that's the most critical part. Like that's definitely the most important aspect about the entire RFC. And yes, where do we start?
I think it'd be good to get a Roy. I mean, either you or I could kind of report on like sort of where the implementation stands right now in the fork of Arborist. All the work is happening there. That's our tree management library that NPM v7 is using.
Yeah. Yeah, right. So we kind of starting, we kind of started the implementation on Arborist, which, yeah, basically is the thing that does NPM install right now for NPM 7. And yeah, so that's I think, yeah, that's probably the main thing I wanted to discuss with probably Jordan and Wes, that they brought up during the RFC, the possibility of installing things in a more flexible layout other than like the usual monorepo. So basically Wes has been advocating for a less monorepo centered approach where you could maybe not hoist all the things to the top and have all this sub-package living in a more independent way so that you can use them, shuffle them around, like eject a package and then be able to run that in isolation. So with the...
Just about that, let me know if you
yeah.
want to wait until you're done.
Yeah, no, just to conclude, is just to bring the point that we actually started the implementation of Arborist. We are realizing that it's actually like more work and not necessarily work that we see right now. Maybe Isaac, you can rephrase this at any point if you think I'm getting this to the wrong point. But maybe think that we don't necessarily want to support in the longer term. We just want to be sure of what we are signing up for, right? In the longer term, the very long term, with the workspace support. So yeah, we're kind of like thinking about doing a more lightweight approach to start with, and going with the thing that makes more sense for Arborist, which is basically hoisting everything to the top. So living in a more monorepo centered for this initial implementation. But we want to make sure that we get like, we don't just get into a corner where we cannot just start supporting in the future, right? We want to be in a good spot for being able to evolve that support in the future. So with that said,
yeah, so the way that Arborist works right now, when you run npm install, let's say you just, let's say you're not using Workspaces, you just have a link dependency. So you have a folder, a folder just in your repo somewhere, in your project somewhere, and then you have a link dependency on that that folder. Let's say it contains some package, which is sort of like the minimum, the bare minimum like atom of what a workspace is. It's essentially a folder that has other package folders within it, and then those things get symlinked around. And so if that top level dep has a dependency on that symlinked package, it will create the symlink in the top level root project, and any dependencies of that package will get installed inside it if they would cause a conflict. But everything gets hoisted up as far as it can by default, because this kind of maximizes deduping, makes for better runtime efficiencies and so on. And so if we take kind of the simplest like first step towards Workspaces, one way to imagine that is to say, okay, if I have a Workspaces declaration, then that's essentially a shorthand for a bunch of linked dependencies, right? So we can say everything, if my Workspaces is like packages/star, then I can say, okay, find all the packages in that folder and then treat all of them as if they were a linked dependency. So create the symlink up to the top level. If they depend on one another, they'll be automatically deduped, and any dependencies that they have, it will hoist up to the top level in the most efficient way possible. So this is not, so this is a a good approach if you're doing things in a workspace in a monorepo centric way, but it does not address the need of, let's say I have a bunch of projects in my projects folder, and then completely out of band and not part of the repo at all, I create a package JSON in that root folder that just says, okay, all of these things are packages. Let me just try and use them all together. Which, for myself, right? Like I manage TAP and I work with NYC, and some of the dependencies I manage, some of them I don't, but I want to make sure everything is working with latest and greatest. I would certainly use this, and it would be nice to not have to migrate everything into a monorepo in order to use it. That being said, if we don't put things in a monorepo-centric way, then what that means is every one of those sub packages needs to have its own package lock file, as well as have those things symlinked into them so that I can CD into that folder, and NPM will know, like when I run npm ls, it won't look like there's a bunch of missing dependencies. The challenge with doing that is it's strictly an implementation detail, and it's not something that's impossible, but it is something that just adds additional work. So the challenge there is managing those metadata files in multiple different locations instead of having kind of one authoritative package lock or shrink wrap for the project from Arborist's point of view. And the second challenge is creating links to a single thing that are in multiple places. So for example, I have this thing in packages/foo, and it has a dependency on packages/var. I need to be able to tell Arborist, like, yes, I know that your dependency is being met by this root level link, but go ahead and also create a second link for that one as well. And so the way that, as we were going through this implementation, we realized all of these things kind of are probably a good fit for a V2 of the Workspaces feature. And it would be great to kind of take the shortest possible path to something something workable, and then we can play test it and also get more of the UX right, and then kind of add that as a relatively straightforward additional bit of functionality that we layer on top.
So I wanted to cut in because you've been diving into some of the technical things, and I think you've been using the term monorepo as if there's one way to do monorepos, and there's quite a large number. I mean, so you alluded to a few of them in what you were just saying, but like some people, like I've seen some approaches where you have a root package JSON and no other package JSONs in the repo. That's how Airbnb's monorepo is set up. So they use a different manifest file and a different in-house tool, but like the use case there is that each individual project says, I'm using this dependency at whatever version the root declares, but maybe I override it with a different version. And so that's the use case there. But then there's things like, Enzyme, which is using Lerna, and the root has some dependencies that are solely for the management of the whole repo, like linting the docs and stuff. And then each individual package has a package JSON that contains precisely the dependencies needed for that package. The intention being that each sub package, if you put it in its own repo, it would immediately work the same. And that is a different level of rigor that not all monorepos follow. And I believe when James Kyle was working on Bolt for a while, he was talking to me, and he seemed to be going for more of the Airbnb approach, which is that individual packages do not list dependencies possibly at all. And that for his, all of them are in the root, and he uses static analysis to figure out which ones should be, down hoisted or whatever. And so there's a lot of approaches here, and I'm philosophically I'm on board with going with something lightweight to start, just to make sure it's right. But I think it's important that if NPM is going to proscribe a workflow, that be a very considered and intentional choice with a long document explaining to all the angry people why their favorite workflow isn't going to work. Alternatively,
this isn't going to work in V1, right?
Yeah, well, and that's fine, but like alternatively making it configurable, or explaining that these other ways will be added in the future, and like not just to placate the angry mob, but also because like there are valuable trade-offs in many of these approaches. And for an internal app, Airbnb's choices made sense. For a published set of libraries, Enzyme's choices made sense, right? And like, I'm sure that's true for many of them, right? Like, so it's, it'd be useful, I think, to try and define like the workflow here. And what Wes was talking about, how it would be great if you couldn't accidentally require something, if a subproject, like for Enzyme's use case, if a subproject couldn't accidentally require something that wasn't listed in its own package JSON. It's also okay if that's not in the first version, but like that seems useful too. I don't know, like the deduping is cool, but like it doesn't have to be in the root node modules necessarily.
Right. The thing is, it's just if we dedupe all the way up to the root node modules, then like it already works. Right, we're 90% of the way there. And if not, then that's going to slow down, and add a lot more work. It's not that we can't do it.
Right.
It's more typing.
Right. And as Wes had pointed out, like if there's the appropriate hooks, you could easily imagine something where like post workspace install, you like move the root node modules to workspace modules, and you like update the symlinks so they still work or something, right? And that's also fine, like as a MVP, to just like leave the hooks for userland to add on. But what I'm trying to stress is that I want to make sure that those workflows are explicitly documented, even if they're not supported in V1, 2, 3, or ever.
Yeah.
Sure, that sounds fair enough.
Can I
just see that Darcy has a raised hand for a while.
Yeah, so just quickly to follow up on what Jordan was saying, like, and I think I mentioned to Roy, you before this call, actually, it would be good to just, and I actually referenced the change sets dictionary. Might be a good idea for us to create some sort of document like that in terms of the language that we're using. So when we reference something like monorepo, we've clearly defined what that means to us, which might help de-obfuscate like some of that confusion, or just like clearly define what we think that means to us, so that if other people have a different definition, then they just know that deviates, or like that they can maybe use a different term. But when we're talking about monorepo, or we're talking about something else, like this is what we mean by that, and we're solving for X use case, that we clearly have defined verbiage that we can all agree upon, or that we can at least point to. So I just linked change sets dictionary, which has at least some definition of a workspace and some definition around some other things there, which I think is at least a good reference, and something we might want to adopt in terms of like having these things defined so that we can better speak to them.
Yeah, it's a great point. I'll definitely take that as a takeaway from for updating the RFC right after the call. And but also, I like the Jordan's suggestion of like trying to document some of the unsupported use cases that we are aware of right now at the moment of the ratifying this RFC, right? So that we can follow up, and people can actually comment maybe their favorite workflow. Like you say, there seems to be like many flavors. So if their favorite flavor is not there, maybe they can raise attention to that.
Well, and the other useful thing that may come out of that. So for example, one thing I wished NPM init had done since day one is ask, is this an app or a package? Like, are you publishing it or not? And that's because like, if it's an app, it should start out private true, and like should probably, should have had a shrink wrap file, or, as soon as that was a thing, and so on. If it's a package, like maybe it can have a package lock, but it shouldn't have a shrink wrap, and it shouldn't be private true. And is it a scope package? It needs to have the publish config and blah, 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 blah. Like kind of meaning in asking about the use case and deriving the defaults from there, instead of asking them as a flat set of questions. And so similarly for workspaces, I suspect that that document will reveal some overarching patterns for use cases where you could ask the question, are you this one of these use cases? If so, here's how you should configure things. And then like that may even be a simplification of the product where you don't need a lot of those things to be specified in package JSON, because you just have some sort of like workspaces workflow equals 1, 2, or 3. and then like override a few things. But like, there's no way to know until we've kind of listed out the things that we think make sense, or like the workflows
So
we think.
I want to circle back to some of the stuff that you brought up, Jordan. From the point of view of the way that we're kind of using the term in this discussion and in other discussions around the Workspaces feature, monorepo does not imply a particular source control system, but essentially what monorepo means is I expect to always download always check out and track all of these different packages in kind of one blob, right? So you can look at something like, to kind of contrast, I might have like a projects/tap folder that has node tap and tap parser and a bunch of other things, T-report, whatever else. But it's not a monorepo, because each one of those things you can very easily go to GitHub/tapjs/whatever and get them as just kind of one-offs. And so, contrast that with something like Istanbul, where there is a single Git repo that has all of the Istanbul libraries listed out, or Jest, or anything else that's currently using Workspaces with Yarn. It is very, very monorepo centric in that way. The other thing to the point about Airbnb and things not having packaged JSON files, they will have to have packaged JSON files. I don't see that changing.
I meant that currently is done because NPM doesn't have any workspace support, and so they had to build internal tooling with an alternative manifest file. I realized it's fine to have packaged JSON files.
But that being said, though, you don't have to list them. I mean, especially if it's internal only, right? Like, you don't have to list them as dependencies of one another if they're being hoisted to the root level in a monorepo, because when they do require foo, they'll get the one that's linked, right? I would still suggest that they add a dependency, just for kind of good hygiene. But that should.
So you're saying all the sub packages get hoisted also. So if I have foo and bar, foo can require bar, as if it was npm installed.
Well,
right, because they're all going to be under the same folder, and they're all going to be symlinked up to that top root of the workspace.
Yeah, so that makes sense. And but I think that for Open Doors case, even now, that since none of the sub packages are published, it's fine. That's perfect, right? But for Enzyme's case, for local development and for testing, most of the time, I want to be able to do exactly that. But I also at some points want to kind of downgrade them from the linked ones to the installed versions that are explicitly mentioned in the range. Yeah. And so it sounds, the implication is that that's going to be supported, which is great.
Well, so that dehoisting and taking them out of the root level workspace is an interesting one. It's not something we're planning on doing for the first MVP of this, but
it works right now, like with npm v6 and local file references. It'll nest things that aren't satisfied correctly, but.
Well, in npm v7, it will. Yeah, if you cd into those folders and then npm install with a link dep, it will work. It'll work that way. However, if you put them all in a monorepo and link them up to the top level, or even if there is a top level node modules that npm install is aware of, it will try to hoist them all the way up if it can. I think for v1 that's probably fine. The interesting thing here about that is, if we do have this dehoisting approach, it occurs to me that may cut off the use case where the root project is itself a package that depends on some of these things, right? Because then when you dehoist, you're essentially breaking that thing's dependencies.
No, but in the case where you have that conflicting version in a leaf node, it automatically, just like you're installing it into normal node modules, it'll nest that version of it underneath that leaf, and it just works from the perspective of the root package, which is not a pattern I really like, but it works in Lerna. I prefer the root package to be the coordinator. It's the dev tools. It's where you run the scripts. But
I agree.
That aside, the nesting really, yes, you're trying to hoist everything, but you're not trying to break no modules resolution, right? It's there's still going to be nesting.
Right. So
regardless.
if there's a conflict, then it will resolve the conflict by adding that that def to kind of shadow the root. Where we're talking about is mostly in the case where there's not a version conflict, or where the version isn't even listed as a dependency. It's just kind of an unlisted dep that gets required in, which is a pattern I don't love. But getting to a point where, like PNPM, where we actually prevent that is quite involved, and I don't see us doing that in the short term.
Yeah, I was going to mention PNPM's approach to this. In the latest major, basically, they have a root link for all of the transitive modules, but every leaf has its own node modules, has their explicit dependencies, symlink back into their fancy symlink registry thing, and so from the perspective of the developers running, working in the monorepo, to Jordan's point, they can't. If they have package A and B as siblings, A can't require B unless it has specified I have a dependency on B, however they want to do that, links or whatever, and so it still preserves a lot of the parsimony of like the most minimal layout on the file system, but it also preserves the correctness in the way that PNPM is famous for. Like it'll throw big, huge errors when you try to do stuff like that. But that's, I understand, to be a bit challenging architectural wise, considering all the other stuff moving in V7. So I'm not expecting that to be a thing by any means. So
it's interestingly enough, with the Arborist refactor, and it's getting a little off topic here, but I think it is potentially relevant, because of how we've sort of isolated out the tree creation and the tree reification. It was actually kind of a design goal to say, if at some point in the future we want to be able to move to something like PNPM, let's make it as easy as possible to do that, and as transparently as possible. So the resulting logical tree that you get back is still what it is now, and so we can do all of the like moving and shaking and shuffling and deduping, but then when it comes time to reify it, right, we can sort of do that in a different way, and when we read it in, we can also sort of notice, hey, this is like using the new format, so let's treat this like, instead of calling this a link dep, let's call it a whatever, right? Right now, if you run Arborist on a PNPM tree, it will work. But if you run npm install on a PNPM tree, it will, pretty much just slaughter it.
yes.
It'll clobber anything that it tries to update, which is, maybe what you want, right? It's probably better to just mow that lawn and now you're in the npm world, rather than crash and burn horribly and require you to start over at least.
So what I get from that discussion is that there seems to be no contention on defining the MPP with just like hoisting the deps the way Arborist will install a regular install tree.
And just to be clear, would npm-ls at the root, like if my sub packages declare version ranges, like will npm-ls at the root still check all the packages trees as well?
Well, yeah, because it's going to be checking the root from the root, right?
It's going to be a single tree.
But the root might be valid, but individual packages might not be. Like, let's say I have 6 packages.
I understand.
And yeah, okay.
Yeah, so it will start from the root. And because of the fact that these the workspace named packages will be linked into the root and will be treated as if they were a link dep of the root, then what's going to happen is when it LS's that, if there's it will actually walk the tree and it will walk through those links to go to that node and then say, does this node have its steps met? Yes or no. based on its real path and everything else. So if anything is missing or is invalid because the version range doesn't match, then yeah, it will throw an error. If, you know, again, if you have foo and bar and foo depends on a version of bar that isn't the one that's linked, and then you just leave the links in place, when you run npm-ls, it will raise an error.
But because of peer deps, and the peer dep will get hoisted to the root, if let's say all of my packages have a peer dep on React and the root has a dev dep on React, but the packages do not, you know, I CD into the packages, npm-ls, I would think would fail. No?
Oh, if you CD into the packages, npm-ls will fail like crazy because everything is going to be missing.
Right. So
it's all
if npm-ls inside the package would fail, I would want npm-ls at the root to fail.
Well, that's the thing. It's only going to fail because it doesn't know to look up past the current working directory.
Right.
Right. But because my sub packages are meant to be individual encapsulated things, that's what I want.
Yeah. So that's V2. That's what we're saying.
That's what we descoped to V2. Yeah. Because right now, so because the original RFC also described having like a package lock for each of the nested package. So we're also descoping that. So basically right now, everything is a single tree for Arborist to install. And there's a single package lock at the top level.
Yeah, I mean, the concern I have, even not in my package, like encapsulated sub-package use case, the concern I have is sort of shared with Wes, which is that like this is going to make it a lot easier to be less explicit with dependencies. And that doesn't seem like a win.
Well,
like it seems like it's, go ahead.
I don't understand.
I just want to say, I don't think it's the package manager's responsibility to you know, slap you on the wrist and say, hey, that's not there. It's you know, using tools. It's using ESLint.
That's what npm-ls does, and that's what npm install and v7 will do. It will fail if your peer deps are invalid, because it is the package manager's job to slap you on the wrist if your deps are invalid.
But your peer deps will be valid, right? Your dependency will be met if you're running it from the root. So there's two things you brought up here. One is, if I run npm-ls from the root, should it find problems? And the answer is yeah, it absolutely will. Like if the tests in there would fail if the deps aren't being met properly, it will fail if you're running it from the root. Now, if you CD into that folder and run npm-ls there, you no longer are in a world where it knows about workspaces.
But I think this is the conceptual issue here, is that what you're saying, that it will just work at the root and so on, like that makes sense to me in a like just nested package JSON scenario. That's totally how it should work. But Workspaces is special. It's a workspace. I'm working within it, and I'm as if it is isolated. That is like if you open up a workspace in VS Code, it doesn't like start like linting the files outside of the workspace. It's right. And if you check out like with I think you can do this with Git, where if you check out like a subdirectory of a repo, like you're only working in that workspace. Like, so to me, like the word workspace, it means it's a conceptual island, and like it should be an implementation detail.
Yeah, this is the ambiguity I really don't like about workspaces. Is several different projects treat workspace as an interchangeable word with leaf package or root node or the whole collection, and that's extremely ambiguous. I don't believe, like I'm on the side of, if you're in a monorepo, you've also called a multi-package repository, you've already opted into the pattern of working at the root, because that's where that's the unit of change as a, you know, conceptual idea. Like, so
I mean, that's true, but monorepo versus multi-repo, I think are different. I would call them different things, in the sense that like a multi-package repo is something where you are, for convenience sake, for tooling sake, you are putting multiple separate, distinct things in one repo. A monorepo workspace, you know, use case is more like, you know, just I got this big ass pile of code, and like I'm trying to make my tooling work a little easier. And to me, that latter one is not the interesting one for NPM to solve, because like because of things like sub packages being published, which is going to be a common use case for this.
Right, but I mean, like how do you? I mean, if you're in a monorepo, it's my understanding is the expected. There's a relationship between the packages. It's not just a big blob of code. Happens to be, you know, n number of packages. It's packages that are intentionally put there for a reason, and they you know they have relationships. So,
but they're not all required to be used together. like all of Jest's packages, you don't have them all installed in most cases. All of Babel's are not all installed in most cases, right? They're grouped together for reasons because they're related, but they're intended to be often used in smaller subsets. And so the isolation is needed in order to ensure that that will work correctly, because it doesn't matter if Babel's monorepo works if when they publish things, all their users are going to break.
Okay, so let's zoom out on this a little bit here, and just kind of like tell you where we're at with V1 and where we're going to get to in subsequent iterations of this, because I think everything you're asking for is reasonable, and it's all stuff that we intend to do in subsequent iterations, but a lot of it is not what's going to happen in V1. And I just want to be super clear about that, because, you know, to kind of set expectations and so we all know sort of where we're working from. So when I talk about things being monorepo centric, right, I'm talking about multiple things with package.json in them, repo. Like that's, for the purposes of this discussion, like that's what a monorepo is. It's a repository or a project which has multiple different folders that each have a package.json that are intended to be used together, at least in development, right? Maybe they're not all being used in all cases at all times by all people with all the other things, but for whatever reason, I want to develop them together and test them together and make sure they all work together properly, right? I think that's a pretty broad description of what we mean when we talk about monorepo from the point of view of NPM. For the initial release of Workspaces, you're going to have to do the install and the listing and a lot of, you know, several of these other actions from the root of that multi-package.json repo, because we're not going to be, for the first pass, not going to be dehoisting, you know, moving those links into each folder that has a package.json within it. I think it's a great feature, and I think it's something that should not be a tremendous amount of work to do, but for the initial release, like, we're just trying to shave it down to like the minimum possible thing that is actually useful. So to Wes's question about like the reason why cross-linking instead of hoisting is more difficult, essentially it comes down to refactoring the places where we track that information and the places where we add those links, or where we add those edges within the arborist tree structure. The shortest possible path from where arborist is in a pre-workspace world to where it could get to is that we essentially in the implementation, we added a new edge type. We added a new edge type called workspace. And we essentially add that as like an edge from the top level into these things. And then when we reify a workspace edge, we do that by creating that symlink. So if we want to move those things into each child package, what we need to do is be able to have a little bit more elaborate referencing, so that we can say this node in the arborist tree is a child package of a workspace, which is a special kind of thing. So we should not hoist its dependencies, and its dependencies, if possible, should be met by a second link to whatever the root level workspace link goes to. Again, it's software, it can be done. It's just a lot more typing, and we want to get something that works and test it out. The other thing about that is, in order to really support that, like I CD into the folder and then it just works, we need to have the package lock, the package lock file in each of those child packages, right? Otherwise you CD into that folder and it doesn't have a lock file, and you install, and now it does have a lock file, and things are all kind of a mess. So we need to update the shrink wrap class, and the way that we're handling that right now, we just kind of slap a shrink wrap object on the root level node, and that's the only one that gets saved after an install. Everything else gets read at read time, but it's not. It's just sort of treated as a source of information, not as something that we write back to. So the other thing, there was another thing here, and I forgot. Oh yeah, so on naming. Yeah, I really wish that I'd been looped in when Yarn was discussing this feature, because workspace can mean several very contradictory things. Workspace can mean the child package, and with the implication that I should be able to work on it in isolation from everything else, as Jordan was kind of bringing up. Workspace can also mean, well, this is the Babel workspace, and each of these packages are pieces of that Babel workspace. Like, I've heard people use it that way, which is completely the opposite. So we ran into this when we were trying to figure out, like, okay, we need to add a workspace class that's like a child class of the node class, but like, wait a minute, is the child package the workspace object, or is the root thing the workspace object? And it's a mess.
I mean, NPM can certainly define new terms here. Whatever terms NPM uses will override any other usage of terms in the ecosystem. So if the word workspace itself is poisoned, it's totally fine if we can come up with reasonable names to better describe the terms. Like, even though everyone wants NPM's workspaces feature, like, they'll get over it if the words are meaningful and not confusing.
Well, and especially if we have some reasonable way to translate, right? If we can say, look, if you have a package.json that has the word workspaces in it, we know that actually means X. And like, that's fine. So yeah, I'm with you. We probably will end up maybe moving to a different terminology or something, but
yeah. It can still be named workspace as a feature, but we can give more specific names for each of these components.
Right. Well, and like Lerna's field is called packages, right? For how you list the globs, and like, you could call it projects. Like, there's a lot of words you could come up with that might be simpler.
Yeah, I mean, the fact, and I'm typing this out right now, the vast majority of package locations in Learn repos are in a directory called packages. I mean, they're not called workspaces, they're called packages. Just a note.
we just even, I don't know, I wonder if there's even some like convention here.
I mean, a dir called packages is what I've seen everywhere, whether they're using Learn or not.
Also, the key in the, if you don't set workspaces in your root as an array, the key that defines all of your child workspaces or the projects in your workspace is packages within the Yarn implementation. So
yeah,
maybe we just make a top level key called packages and we just go with that. And if you have an array called workspaces, then we'll, yeah, okay, you mean packages.
Yeah, I'm totally fine with just like also keeping whatever is kind of established, but we definitely shouldn't be locked with that.
Just a quick time check, got 10 minutes left. So if we want to actually move forward with like ratifying it, maybe we should figure out what's
I think
dissenting.
Yeah. I think for the npm install, like it seems that is a consensus, or well, I think so, right? That we can start with an MVP that will be single tree, hoisting everything to the top, and that we are going to document other possible use cases that we might want to support in the future. And I think there was only one thing related to the installation that I think Wes wanted input from Isaac.
I mean, I think what he wanted was a hook, so that essentially he can write userland code to, do the V2 while only V1 exists. And that seems like a great idea, especially because
even more than
if
that,
it turns out to be common, NPM can just kind of org it in. And
yeah, no, I know that Wes wants to go even beyond what we proposed as a V2, but yeah, like that could be a nice input Isaac to share before moving on.
You may also want to consider not just like a post workspace install hook, but also like some way to override where the symlinks in individual packages are created, so that Wes's userland code doesn't have to go in and redo every symlink. But that may be more complicated. Just something to think about.
So, I mean, Wes has already like gotten his hands dirty with Arborist itself and just kind of like using it as a library. I think that's actually a really good approach to keep going down. On the subject of leaf packages versus root packages, we actually have branch packages as well. So it's possible in our initial implementation already to have a thing in your listed workspaces, which itself has a workspaces declaration and has other child packages within it. It would have been extra work to make that not work. And, like I said, we're trying to carve off added work, but what that means is we let this feature through.
I mean, why is it that much extra work to just like not look at the workspaces field in dependencies?
Because of the, particulars of how the code is structured, and like the easiest place where it was to add that check for the workspace object, just we would have had to, add an extra if block that says if, node equals root.
What happens if I publish a package that has a workspaces key?
So at install time, it only will be relevant if it's a child of a workspace, if it's a declared workspace package, I believe.
Oh, okay. So you're saying I mean.
No, it would work if it's in node modules. Did we have
that seems like a problem.
We also say that the RFC also describes the inability to publish workspaces. So it's an implicit private true. And I think for a lot of reasons, we want to stick with that for this MVP too.
Have you verified there's no existing packages that have a workspaces key in their package JSON?
I'm almost certain there are, because there are several people who choose to publish their root learner package, for example.
That is a fair point. Yeah.
So
obviously that's something you could strip out of the package. But
I don't think it is actually a problem if you have a workspaces declaration in an installed package JSON. All that's going to happen is it's going to say, well, let me glob for all the things in my folder that have that are in that list, and if any exist, I'll add a workspace edge for them, and then I'll symlink them into my node.
And what if my globs have a node modules reference in them?
It's definitely great stuff.
And I install a package that has workspaces that references node modules, and like, I mean,
yeah,
it seems like people are going to do crazy things. So like, it seems wise to maximally limit what they can do at the beginning.
I'd like to see these kinds of desert island scenarios written out in JavaScript rather than in spoken English. I mean, there's probably some interesting demons there. The one easy way to stop at least the problem that you just brought up is we don't scan node modules when we do this glob, right? Like that's pretty easy to do.
And that seems like a good mitigation.
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
We don't scan / node modules or whatever.
Yeah, that's what I'm actually already doing that, and the config mod. Yeah.
I mean, it'd be even nicer if it errored out if the globs point to anything that's inside a node modules folder, because that way people get feedback really quickly.
Like there's code in Lerna to support people having glob stars as their package in their package config and avoiding reaching into node modules. It's extremely annoying, and I wish I didn't have to do it, but open source. The problem being, like, why wouldn't a workspace field in a node module dependency that should be treated like a package lock inside of a tarball? Like it's ignored. The no op. Why would we be even considering this as?
I think we might be checking that the package does not have a parent node, in which case it wouldn't be respected if it's in modules.
Sure.
Roy, you might know that better than I do.
Yeah, no, I think it's something we'll need to add for ours. Yeah. Yeah. So I think another good takeaway is that we'll definitely need some, and we would appreciate some of these tests from user land crazy scenarios to actually be included in the unit test for the workspace support, just to make sure, like, document how it's actually working, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's good. And I'll try and take a look whenever there's an implementation PR up. I'll try and see if I can suggest some test cases. But like my very strong suspicion is that it would be better if, first of all, if Workspaces wasn't nestable, but even if it was, if it very explicitly never did anything inside node modules. And obviously, I hope that the globs also respect git ignore, because otherwise it's a huge mess.
Yeah, so I mean, then we, again, just in the interest of sort of simplifying things, I was wondering, and I think we would need to kind of do some investigation to see, but I was wondering if it might make sense to not support globs, or at least not the full glob implementation for this. The reason being, when you sign up to support all of the globs that Bash supports, it's a bigger thing than I think anybody realizes. It's not as simple as just changing star into .star. It's like, it's really obnoxious.
Yeah.
And like,
Is that the same as the set that git ignore supports?
So it's
because the ability to include things and then bang them out is actually really critical as well. So like Enzyme has 6 things in packages, and one of them is its test suite, and one of them is an example, and neither of those would I want to publish, for example. I know we're doing that later, but
yeah, we also have that in like how we treat the files array. And I think the right answer is we do something very similar to how npm packlist works, and essentially, you know, at some point we take the thing that Roy wrote, which is just using node glob, and we replace it with something very similar to npm packlist, which walks the tree based on the files array.
Right.
I think we're kind of short on time here. Any last licks?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if you want to stick around for maybe a couple more minutes, given that we started late. But if not, we can also wrap up and continue on in the actual Open RFC call. But I think we have a good idea to at least ratify the installation part. But we'll definitely probably want to cover the subcommands. I know I have a big open-ended question on how do we actually filter from all the workspaces you define, all the packages you define in your workspaces field. Like, how do you filter out, or you opt in to more packages? I don't know how we want that flag to behave. And about subcommands, like, yeah, I think we'll definitely leaving publish and version outside of the MVP. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a ton of work to be done, I think, and it's mostly just like a long laundry list of bike sheds to be painted around, like, what exact output do you get from npm-ls when you run it into root of a workspace? If I have 100 packages, it's going to be a nightmare to like list out everything, right? And like, how do we spell -- workspace or -ws equals whatever? Like, we could have all those discussions. The much harder stuff is like, technically, what are we doing, and like, what are we linking, and what are we punting until next time? So I think a takeaway here might be to, you know, carve out the RFC, sort of scale it back to exactly what we're going to be implementing in V1. With a probably long, like, thoughts for next steps section for all the stuff that we discussed for V2 or things to maybe subsequent iteration.
Yeah, maybe move around that kind of stuff that is there into this V2 follow-up section. Yep, that sounds good. So yes, I think that well, it might be enough to follow up on the next Open RFC call. And if there is feel free, if anyone wants to continue the conversation on the RFC itself, if anything comes up that might be actually blocking the ratifying or anything, or then I think it's fair to follow up on the PR, and we can continue on the regular Open RFC call we have next week.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I'll document everything prepared from the attendees we discussed in this talk today.
Awesome.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So thanks everyone
Great.
who showed up. I really appreciate.
All right, thank you.
I
Cheers.
see you
Bye.
next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Oh yeah,
Bye.
and Darcy for taking notes.
All right. Thank you. Bye bye.